The moment Eva Easton stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1879, she said three things that would define the next year of her life, and not a single one of them was a lie. She told the driver that his left rear wheel was cracked along the spoke and would split before he reached the next relay station. She told the man who reached for her trunk that she could carry it herself. And she told the gathered crowd of sun-worn faces staring at her from the boardwalk that she had come to teach school, that she intended to stay, and that she would not be adjusting her opinions to suit the comfort of anyone who could not tolerate honest conversation. The wheel cracked 4 miles outside of town the following morning. The driver came back on foot, sweating through his collar, and did not look her in the eye when he passed her on Main Street. Eva Easton was 24 years old, standing 5 feet and 4 inches on the packed Kansas dirt, with dark hair pinned back from a face that was both striking and serious, and eyes the color of Deep Creek water in the shade of cottonwood trees. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent 3 years teaching in a church school before the pastor decided her opinions on the treatment of the school's Negro students were too inconvenient for the congregation's comfort. She had been offered a position in Caldwell through a letter posted by the Sumner County School Board, which was desperate enough for teachers that they had not asked too many questions. Eva had answered all the ones they had asked with complete honesty. Yes, she was unmarried. No, she did not intend to leave when she found a husband. Yes, she believed girls should be educated with equal seriousness as boys. The school board had written back after a pause of 2 weeks to say that her credentials were acceptable and that the position was hers. Caldwell in 1879 was not a quiet place. It sat near the southern border of Kansas, close enough to Indian territory that the wind seemed to carry the dust of 2 different worlds at once. The Kishom Trail ran through it like a main artery, and the cattle drives brought cowboys north from Texas through the spring and summer months, filling the town with noise and commerce and occasional gunfire that the marshal, a tired man named Aldous Prentice, handled with varying degrees of success. There were saloons and dry goods stores and a livery, and a small church with a leaking roof that the congregation had been meaning to fix for 2 years. And there was a schoolhouse on the east side of town, a single room with 12 desks and a pot-bellied stove that needed new caulking around its base. Eva moved into the boarding house run by Margaret Thorne, a widow of 50 who had deep lines around her mouth from years of saying very little and thinking very much. Margaret showed Eva to a room on the 2nd floor with a window facing east, a narrow bed with a quilt of faded blue and white, and a washstand that rocked slightly on uneven floorboards. "The men will notice you," Margaret said, setting a lamp on the dresser with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting weather. "Some of them will make pests of themselves." "I'm aware," Eva said, hanging her coat on the hook behind the door. "I intend to be very clear with all of them." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and the corners of her mouth moved slightly. "Clear," she repeated, as if testing the flavor of the word. "Well, breakfast is at 6. Eva was clear. She was clear with Reverend Hoskins when he suggested during her first week that her lesson plan should include more scripture and less arithmetic. And she told him politely but directly that the children needed to count as much as they needed to pray, and that she was not willing to sacrifice one for the other. Reverend Hoskins left the schoolhouse with a high color in his face and did not come back. She was clear with Doyle Marsh, a rancher who sat beside her at the Sunday social 3 weeks into her arrival, and told her that a woman with her looks had no business wasting herself in a schoolroom, that she should be keeping a home for a man with prospects. Eva turned to him with a perfectly level expression and said that she found his suggestion both presumptuous and uninteresting, and that she would be grateful if he did not speak to her in that manner again. Doyle Marsh stood up from the table so fast his chair scraped back with a sound like a small explosion, and 3 people at nearby tables pretended very hard to be looking at something else. She was clear with Tom Elwood, a young cowboy who brought her wildflowers in May and left them on her desk before school with a note that said he would call on her on Friday if she was agreeable. Eva wrote back a note that said she was not agreeable, that she valued his kindness but did not share his interest, and that the flowers were lovely and she hoped he found someone who deserved them. Tom Elwood left on a cattle drive 2 weeks later and did not return to Caldwell, which the town seemed to take as evidence of some causal relationship that Eva refused to feel responsible for. She was clear with Jack Whitfield, a land speculator who arrived in June with a suit that was too new for Caldwell and a confidence that was too old for his actual accomplishments. He asked her to dinner at the hotel on 3 separate occasions. She declined all 3 with the same honest explanation, that she did not find him compelling, and that she did not believe in pretending otherwise simply because refusal was considered impolite. Jack Whitfield called her a difficult woman to anyone who would listen, and most people in Caldwell nodded because, by June, they had started to understand what he meant, though they were divided on whether difficult was the right word for it. Margaret Thorne, who heard most of what passed through Caldwell simply by listening at meals and watching from her porch, told Eva one evening in late June that the men in town had begun referring to her collectively as the problem and individually as the most interesting woman any of them had ever met. "They are frightened of me," Eva said. She was grading papers at the small writing table in her room, and she did not look up from the page. "Of them," Margaret agreed. "The rest are just bruised." "I cannot help what the truth sounds like," Eva said. "It sounds the same no matter who says it." "It sounds different when a woman says it here," Margaret replied. "You know that." Eva put her pen down and looked up. "I know that," she said quietly. "I know that very well, but I have tried the other way, and it does not suit me, and it did not make me happy, and the men who wanted that version of me were not men I could respect." Margaret sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the dark Main Street for a long while without saying anything. Then she said, "There are men worth respecting. I was married to one." "What happened to him?" "Fever 6 years ago." "I'm sorry." "He liked that I told him when he was being foolish," Margaret said, still looking out the window. "He said it was the most useful quality a person could have in a partner." Eva picked up her pen again. "Then I am still looking for that kind of man." She did not find him in July, when a deputy named Robert Crane began walking her home from the schoolhouse in the evenings, and then one night took her hand without asking, and she removed it from his grasp with a directness that left him stammering. She did not find him in August, when a cattle buyer named Philip Schieffer told her at the harvest supper that she had a pretty mouth, and she told him that she hoped he was more careful with his professional judgments than his personal ones, because that was a genuinely careless thing to say to someone he had just met. Philip Schieffer left Caldwell the next morning on the earliest stage east and was not remembered fondly. By September, the schoolchildren had begun to whisper among themselves that Miss Easton was the kind of teacher who always knew when you were lying, and always told you the truth whether you were ready for it or not. They said this with a mixture of awe and careful wariness, the way people spoke about weather. Her classroom was ordered and warm and full of the kind of learning that actually stuck, because she took every student seriously and expected every student to take themselves seriously too. The children did their sums and read their passages and asked questions she answered without condescension, and she kept the room clean and the stove fed and the desks level, and she stayed after the last bell to help whoever needed extra time without ever making them feel small for needing it. She loved the work. She had always loved the work. It was the solitary evenings that wore at her, and the accumulated weight of being misunderstood, and the specific tiredness that came from being exactly yourself in a world that kept asking you to be something slightly different. On a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of morning where the plain sky was so wide and clear and blue it almost hurt to look at it, a man rode into Caldwell on a roan horse with a loose shoe on the left foreleg and a bedroll tied behind the saddle. He came from the south, which meant he had crossed up from the territory, and he rode the way men who had been a long time in the saddle rode, with a stillness that was not carelessness but economy, as if every movement had been refined down to its most essential form. His name was Henry Bailey, and he was 28 years old, though he looked like a man who had been 28 for considerably longer than a calendar would suggest. He was lean in the way that men who worked hard and ate only when the work allowed it were lean, with dark eyes that were steady and observant and a jaw that carried 3 days of growth above a plain cotton shirt and a worn canvas jacket the color of dried grass. He carried a rifle in the scabbard on his saddle and a pistol on his hip, as most men in Caldwell did, and he carried these things with the same plain practicality that he carried everything else, which was to say without theater. Henry Bailey had come to Caldwell because he had a job offer. A rancher named Wilprut, who ran cattle on 3,000 acres north of town, needed a foreman who knew both cattle and horses, and was not going to rob him blind or drink himself useless by Christmas. Henry had worked for Prut the previous spring before moving south to winter in the territory, and Prut had written to him at a general address in Wichita with an offer that Henry had decided, after a month of thinking about it in a camp on the Cimarron River, was fair. He rode to the livery first, because that was where the horse's loose shoe needed attention. The farrier, a broad man named Cobb who smelled permanently of hot iron and horse sweat, took one look at the left foreleg and made a sound of professional disapproval that was not directed at Henry but at the general state of horseshoes that had been ridden too long without checking. "I know," Henry said. "I should have caught it sooner. Where are you coming from?" "Indian Territory. Crossed at the Red Fork yesterday." "Long ride?" "It was." Cobb put the horse in a stall and said it would be 2 hours at least. Henry thanked him, untied his bedroll, and went looking for the boarding house. Margaret Thorne opened the door before he knocked a second time, looked him over with the thorough efficiency of a woman who had been evaluating men for 30 years, and asked his business. "A room," he said, "and a meal if you have one going." "I have both," she said. "How long?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm taking a foreman position at the Prut Ranch. Might board in town until I know the situation better." Margaret stepped back to let him in. In the hallway she said, "I have one other boarder, a schoolteacher. I expect you to behave like a gentleman." "I always do," Henry said. He did not meet Eva that first day. He arrived, ate a late meal of beans and bread alone in the kitchen because Margaret's supper hour had passed, and went to bed in the room at the end of the hall, which was separated from Eva's room by the width of the staircase landing. He slept the hard, solid sleep of a man who had been outdoors for 3 months, and he woke at 4 in the morning when the wind picked up and rain began on the roof, and he lay in the dark listening to it and feeling the specific comfort of being indoors. Eva heard the rain too. She had been reading by lamplight, as she often did in the evenings, and when the rain came she set her book down and listened to it, and found that it made the room feel smaller and warmer and less solitary than it usually did. She did not know there was a new boarder. She did not know that on the other side of the landing a man lay awake listening to the same rain and thinking about the peculiar quiet of towns after months in open country. They met at breakfast. Margaret's breakfast table was not large. It sat 4 comfortably and 5 with negotiation, and when Eva came downstairs at 10 minutes to 6 with her hair pinned, and her dark blue dress already buttoned to the throat because Eva did not believe in half measures even at breakfast, she found a man she had never seen before sitting at the end of the table with a cup of coffee held in both hands the way someone held something they were genuinely grateful for. He stood when she came in. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood up from the table when she entered the room, which was a gesture she had encountered in parlors in St. Louis but not often at breakfast in Caldwell, Kansas. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Henry Bailey. I came in yesterday. I hope I didn't disturb you last night." "I didn't hear you arrive," Eva said, taking her usual chair. "Eva Easton. I teach at the school on East Street." "A good thing to do," he said, sitting back down. Margaret came in with the coffee pot and looked between them with the expression of someone who was carefully not having an expression, and poured without comment. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Eva noticed that Henry Bailey did not fill silence with noise the way men who were nervous or performing often did. He ate without hurry and drank his coffee, and when he spoke, he said things that were to the point and then stopped talking. He asked her how long she had been in Caldwell. She told him. He asked if she liked it. She told him the truth, which was that she liked the work very much and found the social dimensions of the town somewhat wearing, and waited for him to ask why or to offer some platitude about how she just needed to give it more time. Instead, he said, "Most towns are more interesting at the edges than at the center." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The people who fit comfortably in the middle of a place are the ones who need the least. The ones who are interesting are usually the ones who don't quite fit, who are doing something different or thinking about things differently. They're usually at the edges." "And which are you?" she asked. "Edge," he said without hesitation. "Always been." Margaret came in with a plate of biscuits and set it between them, and Eva noticed that the older woman was doing an absolutely impeccable job of appearing to have no interest whatsoever in this conversation. Henry left after breakfast to ride out to the Prout Ranch and confirm his start. Eva gathered her papers and her reader and walked the 6 blocks to the schoolhouse, and she thought about what he had said, the edges of towns, and the idea that not fitting was not the same as failing. And she thought that it was the first time in a long while that a person had said something to her that she wanted to keep turning over in her mind. The school day was full. She had 14 students that fall, ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, and they needed different things at different speeds, and she moved between them with the practiced ease of long habit, helping a small girl named Alice with her letters and a serious 12-year-old boy named Franklin with the long division that was giving him nightmares. After the last student left, she swept the floor and checked the stove and walked home through the October afternoon, and the sky was still clear after the previous night's rain, and the air smelled like wet grass and distance. Henry was sitting on the porch steps when she got back to the boarding house. He had a piece of leather in his lap and a small tool in his hand, and he was repairing what looked like a bridle strap with the unhurried focus of someone who was comfortable doing a thing properly without spectators. "How was the ranch?" she asked, stopping at the porch steps. "Good," he said. "Prout's in reasonable shape. The hands are decent. A lot of work to be done before winter. When do you start?" "Tomorrow." She stood for a moment in the afternoon light, and he looked up from the leather. And there was a moment of the kind that is very ordinary on its surface and quite extraordinary underneath, the kind where two people see each other with more clarity than the occasion demands. "You're going to be very busy then," she said. "Always am," he said. He looked back down at the leather. "How was school?" She sat down on the step beside him, which surprised her slightly even as she did it because it was not the kind of thing she normally did. She set her papers on her knee and said, "Good. I have a boy named Franklin who is going to be very good at mathematics if someone just keeps showing him how." "Does he know that?" "Not yet, but he will." Henry pulled the repaired strap taut to test it. "Did you always want to teach?" "Yes," she said simply. "What about you? Did you always want to work cattle?" "I always wanted land," he said. "Working cattle is how I get there." "Where?" "North and east of here. There's a section of land along Medicine Lodge Creek that I've had my eye on for 2 years. Prout is paying me fairly and I'm saving toward it." "That's a real plan," Eva said, because it was, and she liked that it was. "Plans work better when they're real," he said. They sat on the porch steps together in the failing afternoon light until Margaret called them in for supper, and it was the most natural hour Eva had spent in Caldwell since she had arrived. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread and coffee, and Henry ate with the same quiet gratitude he had brought to breakfast, and Eva watched him with the particular attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. He was not a man who performed his goodness. He did not make speeches or try to impress her or say things designed to land well. He said what was true and he listened to what was said back to him, and he seemed, genuinely, to be interested in what she said, which was different from the attention most men paid her, which was the kind of attention paid to an object rather than a person. After supper, Henry helped Margaret clear the table, which Margaret accepted as if it were the most normal thing in the world, though Eva knew for a fact that none of her other boarders had ever done such a thing. In October, they fell into a rhythm without agreeing to it. Henry left early, before Eva was downstairs, riding out to the Prout Ranch in the dark morning while the town was still quiet. Eva breakfasted with Margaret and walked to school and taught her day and walked home in the late afternoon. Henry was sometimes back before dark and sometimes not, and when he was they often sat on the porch for a while before supper, talking with the easy frankness of people who had agreed without saying so that they were not going to waste each other's time with pretense. She told him about St. Louis and the church school, and why she had left. She told it plainly, the way she told everything, without softening the parts that made her look stubborn or the parts that made other people look unkind. He listened through all of it, and when she was done he said, "You did the right thing." "Most people think I should have been more flexible," she said. "Flexible about what?" he said. "About whether children deserve to be taught the same. That's not flexibility, that's just wrong." She looked at him in the lantern light of the porch and felt something shift inside her chest like a door that had been stuck for a long time moving slightly on its hinge. He told her about himself in pieces, the way private people offered things, a little at a time, and only when they meant it. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had died of a chest ailment when Henry was 16, leaving him and his mother and younger sister to manage a farm that was already deep in debt. He had sold the farm because there was no saving it and moved them both west, his mother to an aunt in Independence and his sister to a teacher's college in Lawrence, which he had paid for through 4 years of cattle work. His mother had died the previous winter, and his sister, whose name was Clara, was now teaching school in Emporia, which made him smile when he said it. "So you've paid for 2 teachers," Eva said. "Clara is the better investment," he said. "She takes to it. She's remarkable." "You're proud of her." "Very," he said, and the simplicity of that single word, spoken by a man who did not embroider feelings, went straight into Eva's heart like a needle finding the right stitch. November arrived and brought the first real cold, the kind that came off the plains with a flat, determined force and settled into the bones of the town, and made everyone move slightly faster between buildings and slightly slower in the mornings. The cattle drives had wound down for the season and Caldwell was quieter, with the transient population of cowboys and buyers mostly gone south or east, and the town settled into the particular winter character of a frontier settlement, smaller, more internal, with the sociability of people who knew they were going to be in close proximity for several months and had decided to make the best of it. Eva's school continued through the cold months. She kept the stove fed and the room warm and pushed her students through the winter lessons with the same energy she brought to the fall, and the town, which had spent most of the previous spring and summer being variously unsettled by her directness, had begun by November to settle into a kind of grudging respect. The children who were her students talked about her at home. The parents who had been wary began to see the results of good teaching. And the fact that their children were learning real arithmetic and reading real books and asking real questions that sometimes embarrassed their parents began to count for more than the fact that Miss Easton said exactly what she thought without apparent concern for whether it was comfortable. Margaret told Eva in November that the town had made its peace with her. "What changed?" Eva asked. "Nothing," Margaret said. "They just stopped waiting for you to become someone else." Henry was aware of the shift too. He came into town most Saturdays and occasionally on a weekday evening when the ranch work allowed it, and he noticed the way people spoke about Eva, the teacher, the way they mentioned her with a particular combination of caution and admiration, as you might speak about a weather phenomenon that had turned out to be more beneficial than expected. He noticed it and felt something proprietary and warm about it that he kept to himself. He was not a man who rushed himself. He understood his own feelings with the same steadiness he brought to understanding horses and land, that you had to let things move at the pace they actually moved at, and not the pace you wished for, and that forcing was almost always the wrong approach. But he was aware that in the evenings on the porch and at the supper table, and on the Saturday mornings when they both happened to be around, something was building between them with the gradual inevitability of a season changing, which was slow enough that you could almost convince yourself nothing was happening and undeniable enough that you couldn't quite manage it. One Saturday in late November, they walked together to the general store because Henry needed rope and Eva needed lamp oil, and it was the first time they had gone somewhere together with any kind of purpose, and the town noticed. Eva noticed the town noticing and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came from being observed, the reflexive awareness that people were forming conclusions that had very little to do with the actual facts. Inside the store, while Henry was talking to the proprietor about rope grade and Eva was waiting for her lamp oil to be measured out, a woman named Geraldine Foss, who was the wife of a bank clerk and one of the town's most dedicated social commentators, came to stand beside Eva at the counter and said in a voice designed to be heard by everyone and addressed to no one in particular, "Well, Miss Easton, I didn't think Caldwell had anyone who could manage you. But it seems Mr. Bailey might be up to the task." Eva turned to look at Geraldine Foss with the full precision of her gaze and said, "I don't require managing, Mrs. Foss. I require respect, which is a different thing. I hope you have a pleasant day." Geraldine Foss made a sound like a gate closing and moved to the other end of the counter. Henry came to stand beside Eva with his rope coiled over one arm and looked at her with something in his eyes that was very close to admiration. He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The fact that he did not look at her with the slight wince that most men produced when she said something like that was, at this point, worth more to Eva than most speeches. Walking back along the main street with the lamp oil and the rope, Eva said, "Does it bother you when I do that?" Henry considered the question as they walked, the way he considered things without rushing it. "No," he said, "it would bother me more if you didn't." She looked at him sideways in the November light, the cold air making her cheeks red and her breath a small white cloud. "Most men don't like it. I know, but you told her something true. You do require respect. So does everybody." She was trying to make that sound like a flaw, and it isn't one. He paused. "I've never understood why people think honesty is difficult to manage. I find it easier. I always know where I stand." "Where do you stand?" Eva asked, and the question came out more directly than she had entirely planned, which happened to her sometimes when she was off guard. Henry stopped walking. They were standing in front of the hardware store, and there was a cold wind coming down the street, and a wagon was passing on the other side of the road, and none of these things were the point. He looked at her for a moment with the dark, steady eyes that had been one of the first things she noticed about him. "I stand close to you," he said. "If that is agreeable." The direct answer for the direct question, the precise truth, said simply, "It is," she said. They walked on. But the street looked different, and the cold felt different, and Eva Easton, who had been truthful about everything for the whole of her life, found that she was smiling and that she did not particularly want to stop. December in Caldwell was cold and quiet. The ranch work slowed with the weather but did not stop, because cattle needed tending in winter as in any season, perhaps more so, and Henry was often out early and back late, and sometimes spent 2 or 3 nights at the Prout bunkhouse when the weather made the ride back to town impractical. Eva marked these absences with a practical attention that she refused to call missing him, though Margaret, who noticed everything, said nothing, and instead on those evenings simply brought an extra log for the parlor fire without being asked. On the evenings when Henry was in town, they sat in the parlor after supper, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes playing chess on the old board Margaret produced from a chest in the back room. Henry played chess the way he did most things, with patience and precision and a willingness to think several moves ahead, and Eva played it the way she taught, with energy and a slight tendency toward boldness that sometimes worked beautifully and sometimes ran straight into a wall. They were evenly matched in a way that made the games genuinely interesting, which was to say neither of them won easily, and both of them lost gracefully. One December evening, when the wind was hard outside and Margaret had gone to bed early with a head cold, they were sitting across from each other at the chess board in the warm parlor light, and the fire was good, and Eva moved her bishop into a position she was not entirely certain about and looked up to find him watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with chess. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, but he did not look away. "Henry." "I was thinking," he said, "that I have been very careful not to say things too quickly, and I want to keep being careful, but I also think you would prefer I tell you what I mean rather than not tell you." Eva set the chess piece down. "Yes," she said, "I would." He was quiet for a moment. "I have strong feelings for you," he said. "I think you know that, but I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain. I am not trying to do anything about it quickly because I think you have had a great deal of men trying to do things quickly, and I don't want to be another one of those. But I want you to know where I am." Eva looked at him across the chess board with the firelight on his face and thought about all the men who had come before, the ones who had wanted her to be a version of herself that was more convenient, the ones who had left when she declined to become that version, and she thought about Margaret's husband who had liked being told when he was being foolish, and she thought about the October afternoon on the porch steps and every evening since. "You are not like them," she said. "You have never been like them." "No," he said, "I'm not." "I have strong feelings for you too," she said, with the same plainness she brought to everything. "I have been trying not to move too fast because I have made the error before of confusing admiration with compatibility, and I did not want to do it again." "Have you confused those here?" he asked. "No," she said, after a genuine moment of thought. "I haven't. You are actually compatible with me. It is a remarkably unusual experience." Something in him released, like a rope that has been held very tightly finally allowed to go slack. He leaned forward across the chess board, and she leaned forward to meet him, and he kissed her once, carefully, with all the precision and intention he brought to everything important. When they separated, the fire popped in the grate and the wind hit the window, and outside Caldwell went about its cold December business entirely unaware that anything significant had occurred. "Checkmate," he said, glancing at the board. Eva looked down. She had indeed walked into it 3 moves ago. "You let me think I was winning," she said. "No," he said. "You were winning. Then you got distracted." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind that she did not often produce because real laughter required being genuinely off guard, and she was very rarely genuinely off guard. But Henry Bailey had a way of creating that condition without trying. Christmas came to Caldwell with a dry, cold snap, and a dusting of snow that made the main street look briefly like something from a picture book, before being churned to gray slush by wagon wheels. Margaret decorated the boarding house with pine boughs she had kept dried from the previous year, and the smell of them mixed with wood smoke was the smell of December in every house in the territory. Eva made sugar cookies with Margaret on Christmas Eve morning, which she had not done with anyone since her mother was alive, and found that her hands remembered the motion of rolling dough without needing instruction. Henry came in from the ranch at noon on Christmas Eve with a string of fresh-shot quail and the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a thing correctly. He handed the quail to Margaret in the kitchen and produced from his coat pocket, with the slight awkwardness of a man who was very competent at most things and somewhat less practiced at gift-giving, a small wrapped paper package that he set on the table in front of Eva. "It is not much," he said. Eva unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small book of poems, well used, with a faded cloth cover, Tennyson's collected verse, with a piece of paper tucked into the pages as a marker where someone had clearly read and reread a particular passage, the lines from In Memoriam about loss and love being one thing rather than 2 separate experiences. She looked up from the book. His face was slightly careful, the way it went when he was not certain how something would land. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "It was my mother's." "I've been carrying it for 3 years. I thought," he stopped. You read every evening. I thought you might like it. Eva held the book for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The 3 years and the dead mother and the man who had carried the thing through cattle country and the territory and 2 winters, and had just handed it to her with an expression that said plainly that he meant it to be hers. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, and she did not try to make it steady because that would have been dishonest. He nodded. He understood. He sat down at the table and helped Margaret with the quail, and the afternoon passed in the quiet warmth of a household that had become, without any formal announcement, a kind of family. On Christmas Day, they attended the church service, which Reverend Hoskins delivered with his usual mixture of genuine faith and unfortunate opinions, and Eva sat beside Henry in the pew and did not correct Reverend Hoskins at any point during the service, which Margaret afterward said was possibly the greatest gift she could have given the congregation. They walked home from the church in the thin Christmas morning sunlight, just the two of them slightly ahead of Margaret, and Henry took her hand as they walked, which he had not done before. His hand was large and work-rough and warm, and Eva threaded her fingers through his and felt the specific solidity of it, the particular reality of being held by someone who meant to hold you. "I want to show you the land along Medicine Lodge Creek," he said, "when the weather turns, in the spring." "I would like to see it," she said. "I want to know what you think of it," he said. "I want your honest opinion of whether it is a good place to build on." "You want my honest opinion," she repeated. "I always want your honest opinion," he said. "You know that." She knew that. It was the thing she knew about him most clearly, the thing that separated him from every other man who had come and gone in Caldwell, that he wanted the actual her and not a more manageable version, that the quality in her that drove most people to frustration was the quality that he valued most genuinely. She knew this not because he said it often, though he had said it, but because of how he listened to her, how his face opened when she spoke her mind rather than closing the way other faces closed, how he never once looked at her with that particular expression that said, "Please be less than you are." January was hard. A blizzard came down from the north in the 3rd week and kept the town locked in for 4 days, the kind of weather that closed distances between people or cracked them open. And in the boarding house, the 3 of them played cards and read and talked and ate Margaret's provisions, and the cold outside was so complete and so thorough that the world outside the windows might as well not have existed. On the 2nd night of the blizzard, Henry told her the full story of his father's death, which he had not told before, the way it had happened suddenly in the middle of the planting season when Henry was 16 and the farm was already struggling, how he had stood at the grave feeling the specific weight of being the only man in his household at 16 and not knowing yet what kind of man he was going to have to become. Eva listened to all of it, and when he was done she said, "You were already the kind of man who stays. You were already that person at 16. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Most people, when things become impossible, look for the exit. You stayed with your mother and your sister. You worked 4 years to send Clara to college. You stayed." "There was nowhere to go," he said. "There is always somewhere to go," she said. "You chose to stay. That's different." The wind hit the house with a sound like the world turning over, and the lamp on the table between them flickered and steadied, and Henry Bailey looked at Eva Easton with a clarity that had been building for months and said, "I'm going to ask you to marry me." Eva was very still. The lamp steadied, the wind made its sound. "Are you asking me now?" she said carefully. "No," he said. "I'm telling you that I'm going to ask. I want you to know it's coming so it doesn't catch you off guard. And I want you to have time to think about whether you want to say yes before I ask, so that when I do ask, the answer you give is the one you've actually considered." She stared at him. "That is the most extraordinary approach to a proposal I have ever heard." "It's the honest approach," he said. "You are going to be either very glad I married you or very sorry, and I want you to go in with full information. And if my full information conclusion is that I am going to be sorry, then you tell me, and I respect it." Eva looked at him for a long time in the blizzard night lamplight. She thought about full information. She thought about everything she knew about him, the patience and the steadiness and the chess games and his mother's book of poems, and the fact that he stood up from the table when she walked into a room, and the fact that he had never once asked her to be less than she was. "I will not be sorry," she said. He smiled. It was the full smile she had seen rarely, the one that changed his whole face. "Good," he said. "That is very good to hear." They told Margaret in the morning. Margaret looked at them both with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a train that was running considerably behind schedule but had arrived nonetheless at the correct platform, and said that she was very pleased and that she had suspected as much since approximately October. "October," Henry said. "The porch steps," Margaret said. "You sat together on the porch steps the second day. I have been a reader of people for 50 years. February thawed slowly, as Februaries in southern Kansas did, with warm days that deceived and cold nights that corrected the deception. But by the end of the month the land was waking, the brown earth beginning its turn toward the green that Eva knew was coming. Henry asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in late February, on the porch of the boarding house in a thin winter sun, with the proper words and a small ring that had been his mother's, a plain gold band that fit Eva's finger as if it had been sized for her specifically, which Henry took as a sign, and which Eva took as a pleasant coincidence while privately also being moved by it. She said yes immediately, which was the answer she had had since January. They were married in March in the church, with Reverend Hoskins officiating because he was the only minister in Caldwell, and both Henry and Eva were willing to separate the man's faith from his frequently inconvenient opinions, and Margaret standing as Eva's witness, and Will Prout standing as Henry's, and 14 schoolchildren sitting in 3 rows who had been told by Eva that she expected them to behave with dignity, which they mostly managed. Eva wore her dark blue dress, which was the best dress she had, and Margaret pinned a sprig of dried wildflowers into her hair because fresh ones were not yet available in March, and Henry stood at the front of the church in his best coat with his hair brushed back, and his jaw clean-shaved, and his dark eyes steady, watching her come down the aisle of the small church with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered most to him. Reverend Hoskins read the words. Henry said his with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at Eva without wavering. Eva said hers clearly and without the slight tremble in her voice that she had privately suspected she might have, because she was not nervous, she was certain, which was a very different thing, and certainty did not require steady breathing, it simply required being present. They were married before noon. The whole ceremony took 40 minutes, including the hymn that was slightly too long. The wedding supper was at the hotel, hosted by Will Prout, who was a generous man when it came to occasions that deserved it, and most of Caldwell came through over the course of the evening, which Eva accepted with the same measured openness she brought to everything that was required of her socially. Henry stayed beside her for all of it, not as a shield but as a companion, and when the evening wound down and Margaret went home to the boarding house, Henry and Eva walked back together under a sky full of hard, clear March stars. "You are Mrs. Bailey," he said. "I am," she said. "And you are Mr. Easton Bailey." He stopped walking. "That is not a thing people do in 1879. "I know," she said, "but I said it anyway." He looked at her and she could see him deciding whether to argue this and deciding not to, which was a kind of love also. "Mrs. Bailey," he said. "Both of us," she said firmly. He laughed. Then he took her hand and they walked under the March stars, and she kept the Easton in her name, and he called her both when the occasion called for formality, and Eva always when it did not, and neither of them considered this anything but the right arrangement. Spring came in earnest in April, the way Kansas spring came, quickly and abundantly, with the grass going green almost overnight, and the cottonwoods putting out their first pale leaves, and the sky cycling through the full range of plains weather, sun and wind, and sudden afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the flat land with dramatic visibility. Eva taught through all of it, and Henry worked the Prout ranch through the start of the new cattle season, and they lived in the boarding house while Henry finished the arrangements for the land on Medicine Lodge Creek. He took her to see it on a Saturday in late April when the grass was fully up, and the creek was high with snowmelt, and the cottonwood trees along the bank were in their first full leaf. He pulled his horse to a stop on a low rise above the bend in the creek, and Eva stopped her mare beside him, and they looked at it. It was a good piece of land. The creek bend created a natural shelter from the north wind, and there was high ground above the flood plain that was the right position for a house, and the grass was deep and rich, and there were 3 cottonwood trees of sufficient age to provide shade in summer and windbreak in winter, and the light on it in the late afternoon was the light of a place that had been sitting quietly for a long time, waiting. Eva sat on her horse and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Well," Henry said. "It is exactly right," she said. "That high ground above the bank is where the house goes. The barn goes to the east so it gets the morning light for the animals. You want the garden on the south side where the slope catches the sun." Henry looked at her. "You've done this before." "No," she said, "but I can see it." She looked at the land again, at the bend in the creek and the cottonwoods and the high ground. "It is very much worth staying for." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She took his back. They broke ground for the house in May. Henry hired 2 men from the Prout ranch who had carpentry experience and bought lumber from the mill in Wichita. And in the evenings and on Saturdays, he worked alongside them. And Eva came out on Saturdays to watch the progress and bring food, and occasionally, when she had something to say about the positioning of a window or the pitch of the roof that she considered structurally relevant, to say it. Henry listened to all of it. The house took all of May and into June and was finished by the 23rd of June, which Henry noted was exactly 9 months after Eva had arrived in Caldwell, a fact he mentioned to her with the slight private amusement of a man who noticed the shapes things made. It was a good house. 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen with a proper stove and a front room with windows on both sides, and 2 rooms upstairs, built with the expectation of a future that had more people in it. The porch wrapped around the front and half the south side, which was Eva's specification, because she wanted a place to sit in the evenings that was outside but sheltered, and the porch looked out over the creek bend and the cottonwoods, and in the evenings the light on the water was exactly as beautiful as it had appeared to be from the rise. They moved in on the last day of June. Eva's things were not numerous, having been contained for 2 years in a boarding house room, but they spread into the house with the ease of things finding their places. Her books on the shelf by the window and her blue dress hanging in the wardrobe and Henry's mother's Tennyson on the nightstand upstairs. Henry's things were similarly spare. A man who had been moving for 10 years and had learned to own only what was worth carrying. But the practical things, the tools and the saddle and the rifle and the lamp and the kettle and the extra blankets, arranged themselves around the house with the same quiet rightness. Margaret Thorne came out for supper on the first evening, driving herself in a small buggy that Eva had not known she owned, with a basket that turned out to contain a smoked ham and 2 jars of preserved peaches and a loaf of bread baked that morning. "You did not have to do this," Eva said, taking the basket. "I know," Margaret said. "I wanted to." She looked at the house in the evening light. "It is a very good house," she said. They ate on the porch because the evening was perfect, the kind of evening in late June that exists to be eaten on porches, and Margaret and Henry talked about the cattle market and the condition of the road from town and a proposed new well in Caldwell's East End, and Eva listened and contributed and thought about the word home, which she had not applied to a place with full conviction since her mother's house in St. Louis, and felt it apply now. Henry's sister Clara came to visit in July. She arrived on the stage from Emporia, a young woman of 22 with Henry's dark eyes and a directness that she wore differently than he did, louder and more immediate, with the slightly sharp energy of someone who had made her own way young and knew it. She was a teacher like Eva, and they liked each other immediately in the way that people who share a vocation and a temperament like each other, with the recognition of a kindred quality. Clara stayed 2 weeks. She slept in the second upstairs room and helped Eva in the kitchen in the mornings, and walked the land with Henry in the evenings, and called him brother, with a teasing affection that made Henry's face do a complicated series of things that Eva found immensely endearing. She told Eva on the third day that she had been very worried about Henry finding someone right, because Henry had impossible standards that he would never talk about and had never talked about them because he was Henry, and that Eva was exactly what she had hoped for, which she said with the confidence of a person who had been hoping very specifically. "How did you know what you were hoping for?" Eva asked. They were in the kitchen, putting up the last of the early summer berries that grew wild along the creek. "He told me about you in a letter," Clara said, "before Christmas. He said there was a woman in Caldwell who told the truth at all times, and that most people found it difficult, but he found it useful, and that he thought about her constantly." She looked at Eva with Henry's eyes. For Henry, constantly is a significant word. Eva looked down at the berries and felt the specific warmth of being known by a person who mattered to someone you loved. The summer went by with the full richness of a first summer on one's own land. Henry ran a small herd of cattle on the creek land while continuing the foreman work at Pruitt's, because the land needed stocking and Pruitt's income was what was paying for it. And Eva rode over to Caldwell 3 times a week to continue with the school, which she had no intention of leaving, because the children needed her, and because she was not willing to give up the thing she was good at and loved simply because her domestic circumstances had changed. Henry had never once suggested she should, which she told him she noticed, and which he said he could not imagine suggesting because it would be a peculiar thing to suggest to someone that they stop doing the work they were excellent at. They were very happy. It was a specific kind of happiness, not loud or excessive, but with a depth that Eva recognized as the real kind, the kind that was built rather than found, that grew from actual compatibility and actual respect, and the daily accumulated intimacy of people who chose each other freshly every day. She woke in the mornings beside him with the sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which was a sensation she had never had before, and which she did not take for granted for a single morning. He made her coffee before she was fully awake, because he was always up before her. She told him when she thought he was wrong about something, because she always did, and he listened and sometimes changed his view and sometimes didn't, and either way he thanked her, actually thanked her, for saying what she thought. She read Tennyson on the porch in the evenings and sometimes read passages aloud, and he listened with his hands quiet in his lap in the way he had of listening to things that mattered fully, without the divided attention of a man waiting for something else. She began to learn the land the way he already knew it. She learned the creek's moods, how it ran high in March and April and low and clear in August, and where the cottonwood roots surfaced and where the ground went soft, and which sections of the high ground caught the late afternoon light longest. She learned the cattle, which she had not expected to find interesting and found deeply interesting, the hierarchy and the movement and the way a healthy herd behaved versus one under stress. Henry taught her without condescension, with the same pedagogical instinct she had, that a good teacher showed you the thing and trusted you to learn it. In September, Eva discovered she was pregnant, which she had been expecting to discover, and which filled her with a complex and powerful feeling that she described to Henry with her usual precision as being larger than happiness and more complicated than fear and mostly just enormous. Henry took her hands in both of his when she told him and held them for a moment without speaking, and then said, "Good." "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. "Very good," she laughed. You could manage a slightly more extensive response. He thought for a moment. "I am very happy," he said. "I am a little frightened, which I think is the appropriate response. I think you are going to be a remarkable mother, which is not in question, and I am aware that the second upstairs room is now going to become something other than a guest room, which means we need to write to Clara and tell her to plan ahead when she visits. Eva shook her head slowly. That is the most practical set of responses to news of a pregnancy I have ever heard. You wanted more. No, she said, and took her hands back gently and held his face in them for a moment. It is exactly right. You are exactly right. The pregnancy went well. Eva taught through the winter, which caused a quantity of comment in Caldwell from various quarters about propriety and appearances, all of which she handled with the same level expression she used for everything that did not merit more. And she continued teaching until February, when the baby began to be imminent enough that even she acknowledged that 14 schoolchildren and active labor were probably incompatible schedules. The school board hired a temporary teacher from the county seat, a young man named Hobbs who was competent if not particularly inspiring, and Eva oversaw his first 2 weeks with an attention to detail that left him slightly pale but considerably better prepared. The baby came in March 1881, on a morning when the early spring wind was strong and the creek was beginning to run high with the first melt, and Margaret Thorne came out from Caldwell to attend along with Dr. Haskell, a steady man of 50 who had delivered most of Caldwell for 12 years. Henry waited in the kitchen with the particular stillness of a man exercising maximum control over something he could do nothing to help, and Margaret came down twice to report progress and once to tell him firmly to eat something. The baby was a boy. He was born in the upstairs room as the morning turned fully light, and Henry came up when Margaret called him, and Eva was sitting up in bed with this entirely new small person in the crook of her arm, looking at Henry from across the room with an expression that was exhausted and triumphant, and soft in a way her face was not often soft. Henry crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was red and new and perfect and looking at the world with the dark, unfocused eyes of someone arriving somewhere surprising. He has your eyes, Eva said. He has your mouth, Henry said. Look at that. What shall we call him? Henry had thought about this. James, he said, for your father if you are willing. Eva's father had been dead for 4 years, lost to a fever in St. Louis, and she had not spoken of him often, but she had spoken of him with love. She looked at Henry, and the fact that he had remembered and had thought to offer this was one of the finest things he had ever done. James, she said. James Bailey. James Easton Bailey, Henry said. She looked at him. You kept yours, he said simply. He can carry both. She had told the people of Caldwell that she required respect rather than managing. She had told them this in a store, publicly, to a woman who had tried to reduce her to something smaller than she was, and the man beside her had said nothing because he had not needed to. But now in the quiet of the upstairs room with the spring wind at the window and their son between them, she understood that Henry had been saying the same thing in his own way every day since October, in the quiet actions of a man who saw her clearly and chose her freely and stayed. Every man left until one stayed. James Easton Bailey slept in his mother's arms, and his father put his hand over both of them, the careful protective warmth of it. And outside the creek was running high with the spring, and the cottonwood trees were putting out their first tentative leaves, and the land that Henry had been working toward for years was settling into what it had always been waiting to be. Eva went back to teaching in May when Hobbs returned gratefully to the county seat. She brought James to the schoolhouse on the days when Henry was too deep in the ranch work to stay with him, setting up a small corner near the stove where the baby could sleep in his basket while she taught, which the children found so entirely captivating that, for the first 2 weeks, she had to remind them regularly that James was not the subject of the lesson. He was, however, an educational presence in his own right, because his simple existence in the schoolroom prompted questions that Eva answered with the same directness she always used, and the children who were old enough to understand learned something about the nature of new life and family that was worth knowing. Henry came to get them both in the late afternoons, riding the roan horse, which had a new shoe and was in good condition, and he would tie the horse outside and come in the schoolhouse door at 4 o'clock, with the particular combination of work tiredness and evening anticipation that Eva had come to read as his end-of-day face. And he would take James from her arms with an ease that had grown from the first terrified carefulness of March into the settled competence of a father who knew his child. And James would respond to this transfer with the pleased recognition of someone arriving in a familiar place. They walked home in the late afternoons along the road from Caldwell to the Creek house, Eva and Henry with James between them, and the plain sky going through its evening colors above them. And they talked about the day, the school and the ranch and the cattle prices, and the well that needed new casing, and the letter Clara had sent from Emporia saying she was stepping out with a schoolmaster named Wallace, and the ordinary things of a life that was being built daily with intention and care. Will Prout stopped by in October, the first October anniversary of Henry and Eva's first real conversation on the porch steps, to tell Henry that he had been offered a considerable sum for the ranch from a land company out of Chicago, and that he was minded to take it, and that he wanted Henry to know before it was announced. Henry thanked him for the warning and that evening told Eva, and they sat on the porch with James asleep upstairs and the October evening around them, and thought about what it meant. What it meant was that Henry's foreman income was likely to change, because Chicago land companies brought their own managers. He told Eva this straightforwardly, because he always did. "We have the cattle," Eva said. "We have 20 head," Henry said. "That is a beginning, not a living." "Then we build it into a living," she said. "You have the land, the creek land is good, you expand the herd. That takes capital we don't have." "How much?" he told her. Eva was quiet for a moment. "I have been saving part of my school salary since I arrived in Caldwell," she said. "I never told you exactly how much. I kept it for an emergency. I think this qualifies." "How much?" he said. She told him. Henry was quiet for a longer moment. He looked at her with his dark, steady eyes. "You've been saving since before we were married." "Since before I arrived," she said. "I always save a third. My mother told me to. She said a woman who saved her own money was a woman who always had options." "Your mother was very wise." "She was," Eva said. "She would have liked you." They sat with the October darkness and the creek moving below them and the cattle sounds from the small pasture Henry had fenced that summer, and they made a plan. Henry would approach 2 neighboring ranchers about purchasing shares in the cattle he intended to buy, which would spread the risk and the cost, and Eva's savings would cover the initial stock and the fencing for the expanded south pasture, and Henry would manage the increased herd himself through the winter until the Prout sale was either completed or fell through. The Prout sale went through in January 1882. The Chicago company sent a man named Hargrove who wore a city suit and had a great many opinions about the operation of Kansas land, from a position of never having been to Kansas before, and Henry spent 3 weeks showing him the operation with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that irritation was not a productive response to ignorance. Hargrove offered Henry a position as foreman under the new management at a reduced rate. Henry thanked him for the offer and declined it. "You could have named your price," Eva said that evening. "I could have," Henry agreed. "I don't want to work for a man who doesn't know the land and won't listen. I'd spend half my energy correcting his mistakes and the other half being blamed for them. So we rely on the cattle." "We rely on the cattle," he said, "and your school salary for the steady income until the herd grows." "I have a condition," Eva said. He waited. "You don't make major decisions about the ranch without me," she said. "I know that's not how most husbands and wives manage things here. I know it is unusual. I am telling you that it is what I need." "I know that," Henry said, with a slight expression that was almost affronted. "I would not do it any other way. When have I made a major decision without you?" She thought about it. He was right. He had never made a major decision without her, not since the very first month when they were barely acquaintances, and he had told her his plan for the land on Medicine Lodge Creek and asked what she thought of it. He had been including her in everything from the beginning, not as a courtesy but as a genuine consideration, because he actually wanted to know what she thought. "Never," she admitted. Then the condition is already met, he said. You can state it whenever you need to for the record, and it will remain met. The spring of 1882 was good for cattle. The grass was deep, and the water was plentiful, and Henry bought 28 additional head at the Wichita market in April, expanding the Bailey herd to just under 50, which was the beginning of something real. He hired one hand, a young man of 19 named Eli who was half Cherokee on his mother's side, and had grown up knowing cattle and horses from his youth in the territory, and who arrived with the kind of quiet competence that required no performance. Eva liked Eli immediately, not least because he was direct in the way she was, without the particular social elaborations that the town tended to produce. Eva was aware that in this territory, the Cherokee and other peoples of the 5 civilized tribes had been promised the land by treaty, and that those promises had been systematically broken, and that the land Henry now owned had its own complicated history, as all land in Kansas and the territory did. She was aware of this in the specific way of someone who paid attention to the actual history of things. She talked about it with Eli once carefully, because she wanted to say what was true rather than what was comfortable. Eli looked at her with an expression that she could not quite read for a moment, and then said, "Most white people don't say it out loud." "Most people don't say things that are uncomfortable out loud," Eva replied. "I have never been good at that." "I know," Eli said. "Mr. Bailey told me when he hired me that his wife was the most honest person in southern Kansas." He paused. He said it like it was a very good thing. "It is," Eva said firmly, "whether it is comfortable or not." Eli stayed with them for 3 years, building the small operation on Medicine Lodge Creek into something that sustained itself, before moving on to a larger ranch near the territory border. And when he left, he shook Henry's hand and looked at Eva and said, "Thank you for saying the true things." And she took that with her. James turned 2 in March 1883 and had his father's steadiness and his mother's complete inability to leave a question unasked. He spoke early and clearly, and by 2.5 was following Eva around the house, asking about the names of things with the methodical persistence of someone who intended to know everything eventually. Eva taught him letters when he was 3, which he absorbed with a seriousness that made Henry, watching from across the kitchen, produce the full smile that appeared rarely and meant everything. The spring of 1883 was when the cattle operation turned the corner from hopeful to stable. Henry sold 40 head at the spring market in Wichita at a price that covered the winter costs and left enough to put into the next purchase. He came home from Wichita on a Thursday evening in May, and Eva met him at the porch with supper waiting and James running to his father across the yard, with the complete physical commitment of a 3-year-old who has no awareness of consequences. Henry swung James up and set him on his shoulder and walked up to the porch and looked at Eva with the look that she had learned meant he had something to tell her. "Good trip," she said. "Very," he said. "We are clear for the year." "I know," she said. "I did the numbers yesterday." He laughed. "Of course you did. I thought you would want to know before you got back," she said, "so I did them. And we are better than clear. If you buy 30 head in the fall and hold them through the winter, by spring of next year you are looking at a herd of 80. At the market price we got this week, that is, a real cattle ranch," he said. "A real cattle ranch," she confirmed. Henry stood on the porch of his house in the May evening light with his son on his shoulder and his wife looking at him with those creekwater eyes, and felt something in him that he was not always able to name, but always able to recognize as the sum total of everything he had been working toward for 10 years. It was not the cattle or the land or the income or the house. It was this specific arrangement of things, her honest face and his child's weight on his shoulder, and the creek running below the rise and the years of work behind, and the years of work still ahead, all of it part of one continuous thing that he was glad of, deeply and specifically glad of, in a way that required no embellishment. "Come inside," Eva said. "Supper is getting cold." Eva became pregnant again in the winter of 1883. She told Henry in December with the same directness she had used the first time, and he responded with the same immediate gladness and practical thinking. And this time there was less fear in it on both sides because they had done it once and they knew the shape of it. Their second child, a girl, was born in August 1884, in the same upstairs room where James had been born, on a hot August morning when the creek was low and clear, and the cottonwood trees outside the window were still and full. They named her Ruth Margaret Bailey, Ruth for no particular precedent except that it was a name Eva had always loved, and Margaret for the woman who was summoned from Caldwell, the moment labor began and arrived with her basket and her 50-year-old efficiency, and her deep affection for the family that she had watched begin on a boarding house porch. Margaret Thorne was in the room when Ruth was born, and she held the baby for the first time while Henry held Eva's hand and James, who was 4 and had been told what was happening, and had absorbed this information with the literal acceptance of a young child who had not yet learned to find things impossible, stood at the door of the bedroom in his nightshirt with very serious eyes. "Can I see?" he said. "Come in," Eva said. James crossed the room with careful steps and looked at his sister in Margaret Thorne's arms. "She is small," he said. "You were smaller," Henry told him. James considered this information with the gravity of a child revising his understanding of his own history. Ruth Margaret Bailey was not small for very long. She grew with the same determined purpose that characterized everything in that household, and by the following spring, she was sitting up and looking at the world with Eva's dark eyes and Henry's expression of considering everything carefully before responding. They were 5 in the house then, 5 being Henry and Eva and James and Ruth and Margaret Thorne, who had come to help in the weeks after Ruth's birth and had not entirely gone back, which nobody mentioned and everyone was glad of. Margaret slept in the second room downstairs that had been Henry's study, and Henry moved his desk to the corner of the front room, and Margaret took over the kitchen in the mornings with an authority that everyone including Eva was relieved to defer to. Caldwell grew around them. The 1880s brought the railroad further south and more settlers into Sumner County, and the cattle trail that had defined the town began to shift its character, the wild edge of it smoothing slightly as permanence arrived. Eva watched the change with the attention of someone who had been there long enough to see the before and the after, and she taught the children of the new settlers as she had taught the children of the old, and the school grew, requiring a second teacher by 1885, a young woman named Miss Pierce, whom Eva hired and trained with the same exacting standards she applied to herself. Henry's cattle operation reached 80 head in the spring of 1884 as predicted, and 110 by the spring of 1886, and by then he had hired 2 permanent hands and was buying and selling with the confidence of a man who understood his market and his land. The section along Medicine Lodge Creek that he had once described to Eva from the porch steps of a boarding house, as the plan was now a working ranch that was paying its own way and building toward something larger, and the house on the rise above the creek was no longer the simple 2-room structure they had moved into, but a properly expanded home with a good kitchen and a covered porch and a garden on the south side that was exactly where Eva had said it should be. She grew the garden herself in the early mornings before the school day, the way she did everything important, with attention and with pleasure, and with the particular satisfaction of growing something that fed her family from her own soil. She grew beans and squash and tomatoes and root vegetables, and in one corner a small section of herbs that she kept for medicine and cooking in proportions that she had learned from a neighbor woman on the creek's south bend, a Cherokee woman named Delia, whose family had lived on that water for longer than the town of Caldwell had existed, and from whom Eva learned things about the land that no settler had taught her. The friendship between Eva and Delia was unusual by the standards of 1880s Kansas and unremarkable by Eva's, because Eva applied the same standards to everyone she respected regardless of what the social conventions of the territory had to say about it. They talked over the fence between their gardens in the early mornings when their paths crossed, and Delia showed Eva which plants could be pressed for fever and which bark could be steeped for pain, and Eva showed Delia the long division method that her son, a quiet boy of 10 named Crow, was struggling with, and Delia brought him to Eva's schoolhouse the following autumn, which was not without social friction in Caldwell in 1884, and which Eva handled with the same level directness she always brought to friction. Which was to say, she continued doing what was right and waited for the town to finish having its feelings about it. Crow turned out to be brilliant at mathematics. By the time he was 14, he was past what Eva could teach him in Caldwell, and she wrote a letter to the teachers' college in Lawrence on his behalf, the same college Henry had paid to send Clara to, and included with it the most detailed and precise academic recommendation she had ever written, which took her 3 evenings to compose because she wanted every sentence to carry the full weight of what she meant. Crow was admitted the following year on the strength of his examination results, and when he left on the stage north, Eva stood on the platform and shook his hand and told him that he was going to do exceptional things, and meant it, and he believed it because Eva Easton Bailey said exactly what she meant, always. James Easton Bailey started school at Eva's schoolhouse in 1886, at 5 years of age, which was slightly early, but James had been asking about it since he was 3, and Eva saw no reason to make him wait for the sake of convention. He sat at the desk in the front row nearest the door, which was the desk that every student Eva had ever loved best had gravitated toward without being told, and he looked up at his mother at the front of the room with the dark, steady eyes of his father and the eager, open face of a child who wanted to know things. And Eva taught him with the same exactness she taught everyone, without special treatment, and with the same high expectation she held for all her students. She would not give him easier problems because he was hers, and she did not require less of him because she loved him, and he understood this early, and in understanding it came to understand something about the nature of love that served him all his life, that the real kind did not protect you from difficulty. It expected you to rise to meet it. Ruth was 2 when James started school, a round, determined child who followed her father around the ranch yard with the same methodical attention James gave to books, and Henry took her with him on his morning rounds, with the patience of a man who understood that watching someone work was a form of education. She learned the cattle before she could read, knew their names and their habits and the specific behaviors of healthy versus sick animals, and Henry answered her questions with the same respect he gave all questions, completely and without condescension. In the evenings of 1886 and 1887, and into 1888, Henry and Eva sat on the porch they had built above the creek as the day wound down, with the plain sky going through its colors above them, and the smell of the garden on the south side, and the cattle sounds from the pasture, and the children's voices from upstairs where Margaret was overseeing the end of the day with the calm authority of 50-something years of competence. Henry had his coffee and Eva had her tea, and they talked about everything, and said what they thought and disagreed occasionally, and were never unkind about it, and laughed sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and the creek below them moved through its seasons, high and cold in spring and low and warm in summer and middle running in the falls and nearly still in winter, and it was always there. Henry had white beginning in his dark hair by 1888. He was 37 years old, and he wore the decade of heavy outdoor work in the particular way of men who had always been lean, not old exactly but settled, the way a good post settles into its ground. Eva was 33 and still had her mother's dark hair without any white, and the Creekwater eyes that had been the same since Caldwell, still exact and direct and capable of the full precision that had sent Philip Schieffer to the early stage east 9 years before. They were, in every way that could be accounted for, deeply and actually happy. Not the performed happiness of people who needed others to believe it, but the working happiness of people who had built something together and knew its value because they had built it, who had chosen each other with full information, and continued to make that choice daily without requiring it to be spoken, though it was spoken often, in the plain, direct way of people who did not believe in keeping what was true to themselves. Clara came back to visit in the summer of 1888 with her husband Wallace, who was indeed a schoolmaster, and who was exactly the right man for Clara in exactly the way Henry was the right man for Eva, which was to say he was not intimidated by her, and found her sharp mind a source of pleasure rather than a challenge to be managed. They came for 2 weeks and the house was full, 4 adults and 2 children and Margaret, and the evenings on the porch went late and noisy, and Henry sat back and watched his sister and his wife, talking with the full engagement of 2 people who liked each other very much, and felt the specific quality of gratitude that came from seeing the people you loved most in the world also love each other. Clara told Eva on their last evening, sitting on the porch after the children were asleep, that Henry had written to her in December of 1879, right after they had had what Clara called their first real conversation, and that the letter had been 3 pages long, which was extraordinary for Henry, who normally wrote 2 paragraphs. 3 pages, Eva said. What did it say? He described you, Clara said. For 2 pages he just described what you were like. How you spoke and what you said and how you thought about things. And the 3rd page was him asking me what I thought it meant that he had been paying this much attention to someone he had only just met. Eva was quiet for a moment. The creak sound came up from below the rise. What did you write back? I said it meant he was already in love with her and should probably get on with it. Eva smiled into the darkness of the porch. He took until March. That is fast for Henry, Clara said. They laughed together on the porch in the August night, and from inside the house came the sound of Henry and Wallace's voices in the front room, low and easy, the sound of 2 men who had become comfortable with each other. And above them the plain sky was full of summer stars from one edge to the other, and the cottonwood trees moved very slightly in the warm night air, and everything that had been built from that October morning in 1879, when a man rode into Caldwell on a roan horse with a loose shoe, was present in this moment, contained in it, the way all preceding moments were contained in the present one. The years continued the way years did, not dramatically but thoroughly. James grew tall and learned everything the school and the ranch and his parents had to give him, and at 15 was already the kind of young man who could be relied upon for the things that mattered, which was the thing Eva had always been trying to teach, and which in her own son she could see with the particular clarity of someone who knew what she was looking for. Ruth grew into herself with the combination of her father's patience and her mother's certainty, and at 12 was already running sections of the ranch with Henry, not as a novelty but as a genuine participant in the work, because Henry saw no reason why she should not. And Eva had been saying since before the girl was born that girls should be taken as seriously as boys. Henry bought the adjacent section of land in 1890, expanding the Bailey Ranch to nearly 600 acres along the creek, and by then the cattle operation was large enough to employ 4 hands and small enough to remain the kind of operation a man could know personally, which was how Henry preferred it. He knew every animal and every acre, and the name of every person who worked for him, and the particular requirements of each, and he managed all of it with the same steady intention he had always brought to things. Eva taught in Caldwell until 1891, when the school board, newly constituted with a different set of members and a different set of opinions, appointed her the district's head of education for Sumner County, a position that had not previously existed, which she accepted on the condition that it came with actual authority to make curriculum decisions, and not simply the title without the substance. The board agreed, somewhat warily, and Eva spent the next decade building the county school system into something that was consistently better than average for Kansas, which in the 1890s meant significantly better than most of the surrounding territories. Margaret Thorne died in the winter of 1892, peacefully, in her room in the house on Medicine Lodge Creek that she had occupied since Ruth's birth, in the bed she had made her own in the 8 years since she had not quite gone back to the boarding house. She died on a February night when the wind was quiet and the fire was good, with Eva sitting beside her in the way. Eva sat beside the things that mattered, fully present and not pretending otherwise. Eva buried her in the small cemetery north of Caldwell beside her husband, and stood at the grave in the February cold and said, without softening it, that Margaret Thorne had been a woman of complete practicality and deep love, that she had watched and listened and kept her own counsel and given it when asked, and that she had been the first person in Caldwell to look at Eva Easton without asking her to be different, which was a thing she did not intend to forget. Henry stood beside her at the grave with James and Ruth on either side of them, and he took her hand the way he had taken it that first Christmas morning, with the solid warmth of someone who meant to hold you, and she took his back. In the spring of 1893, they planted a cottonwood sapling in the garden, in the corner nearest Margaret's kitchen, in memory of a woman who had always known the right thing to say and had often chosen silence anyway, and it grew. The 20th century arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with the particular combination of anticipation and continuity that new centuries always brought to old places. James Easton Bailey was 20 years old in 1901, a young man of his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, who had been accepted into the land-grant college at Manhattan to study agricultural science, which he intended to bring back to the ranch on Medicine Lodge Creek. Ruth Bailey was 17 in 1901, already being considered for the Teachers' College in Lawrence the following year, and already managing the South Pasture rotation with the same competence she had shown since she could ride. Henry and Eva sat on the porch on the first morning of 1901, which was cold and clear and still, with the Century brand new above them, and the creek below them in its winter low voice. 22 years, Henry said. Eva considered. He had arrived in October 1879. It was January 1901. 21 years and 3 months, she said. He gave her the look. I rounded. You should not round when I am present. He took her hand. 21 years and 3 months then. Are you still glad? She turned to look at him. He was 49 years old, and the white in his hair had won out over the dark in the last 5 years. But his eyes were the same dark, steady color they had always been, the eyes that had looked at her across a breakfast table in the first weeks and asked her questions he actually wanted the answers to. You asked me something like that once before, she said. On a blizzard night in January of 1880, you told me you were going to ask me to marry you and asked if my full information conclusion was that I was going to be glad. I remember. I told you I would not be sorry, she said. You did. That was not the strongest possible endorsement, she said. I was being careful. I know. I am considerably less careful now, she said. I have 21 years and 3 months of actual information. I am not sorry, Henry. I have never been sorry. I am the opposite of sorry in a way I do not have the exact vocabulary for, which is rare for me. He brought their joined hands up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles in the gesture that was not formal in the way it might have been in another person, but in him was the most deliberate form of tenderness, and she let him hold her hand against his face for a moment in the cold January morning. I love you, he said. I have always loved you. I loved you before I said it, and I'll love you after everything I can say runs out. That is very long, she said. It is. I love you too, she said. I have been telling you so since December of 1879, in my way, which is the same as your way, which is the doing of things rather than the constant saying of them, though I will say it also. I love you exactly as you are. The creek moved below them. The cottonwood trees were bare in the January morning, but they would leaf in April. They always did. The same trees they had planted and watched and sat under for 2 decades. The same water below the rise, the same land that Henry had seen from a distance in 1878 and moved toward with the patient certainty of a man who knew where he was going. James left for the college in September with a trunk and his mother's complete confidence and his father's handshake, which was the kind that held a moment longer than necessary. Ruth started at the Lawrence Teachers College the following year, which produced in Eva a complex and specific emotion that she described accurately as being very proud and somewhat bereft, and entirely right about the whole thing. And the ranch on Medicine Lodge Creek continued into the new century with the deep roots of a thing that had been built well, with the best materials, care and honesty, and a man who stayed, and a woman who never asked him to be anything other than what he was, and the creek that ran through it all in every season, and the light on the water in the late afternoons that was exactly as beautiful as it had appeared to be from the rise on that April day in 1880 when Eva Easton had looked at a piece of land and said it was exactly right and meant it, as she meant everything she said, without excess and without diminishment, only the plain truth of it. The truth, as it turned out, was enough. The truth, spoken clearly and without apology, had driven away every man who could not receive it and had held close the one man who could not do without it. And he had stayed, not because the truth was easy or because she was easy or because the land was easy or because any of it was easy, but because real things were worth staying for, and she was the most real thing he had ever encountered. And he knew it from the first October morning on the boarding house porch steps. And he never stopped knowing it for a single day of all the days that followed. "Keep going," he had said to her in the middle of the second winter when the cold was hard and the cattle were restless, and the school had been closed for a week by weather, and she had stood in the kitchen with the flour on her hands and the specific tiredness of a woman who was managing too many things, and asked him honestly if she was doing enough, if she was getting it right. And he had set his coffee down and looked at her with the full attention of his dark eyes and said, "Keep going, Eva, keep going. Because you are exactly who you are supposed to be, and this is exactly where you are supposed to be, and everything you are doing matters, and I have been watching you do it, and I will be watching you do it as long as I have eyes to watch with, so keep going." She had kept going. The flour on her hands and the cold outside and the cattle in the pasture and the children upstairs and the books on the shelf and the Tennyson on the nightstand and the garden on the south side and the creek below the rise and the light on the water and the years of it. The accumulating years of a life built honestly on land that was worth staying for, with a man who was worth staying for, and every morning of it chosen, freely and fully, with complete information. Eva Easton kept going. And it was more than enough. It was everything.